Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I'll never forget the day I moved into 42 Hawthorne Lane. It was the perfect apartment. Everything I had dreamed of. The rent was ridiculously low for the location, and the space, well, it was almost too good to be true. I'd been searching for months. Every place either too small or way out of my budget, but this was it. When I first stepped into the apartment, I didn't know what to expect. The floor creaked under my feet, and the smell of dust and old wood filled my lungs. But there was something comforting about it, something nostalgic. It felt like home from the very first moment I walked in. The high ceilings, the tall windows that let in a soft golden light, and the warmth of the wooden floors beneath my feet. It was perfect. I could already picture my life here, a new chapter away from everything. A fresh start. The walls, though chipped in places, had this worn beauty about them. Faded yellow paint, like the sun had kissed it for years, left marks of warmth and comfort. The light streaming through the window cast long shadows across the room, bending with the rhythm of the day. Everything was still, too still. Like the apartment was waiting for me, waiting to tell me its story. I didn't know its story then, and I should have asked, but I was too distracted by the excitement, the promise of a life I could finally control. I dropped my keys onto the kitchen counter and wandered through the space. The kitchen was small, but had this vintage charm. A sink with a chipped porcelain basin and an old stove that looked like it had cooked hundreds of meals, if not thousands. I opened the cabinet doors and smiled at the echo of the room, its emptiness, as though it was just waiting for me to fill it. My heart swelled with anticipation. I walked down the narrow hallway, past a closet and into the small bedroom. The bed would go here, I thought. Maybe a bookshelf along that wall. I could make it cozy, comfortable. It could be mine. The apartment could finally be mine. But as the sun dipped lower, casting everything in a dim, eerie light, I started to feel it. A strange unease. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. The shadows in the room felt too deep, too much. I shook it off. Old houses creak. It was just the building settling, that's all, just the wind. I took a deep breath, ignoring the way the air seemed heavier in the corners, and kept going. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, set my things down in the living room, and began unpacking. But then, the whispering started. At first, I thought it was just the wind again. A draft, maybe, coming through the cracks. But no, it wasn't the wind. It was too soft, too precise. It was like a voice, barely audible, just on the edge of hearing, too low to make out any words. But it was there. I froze, my hand still on the box I was unpacking, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. I listened closer. Grace. I blinked, my heart leaping into my throat. There it was again. My name. A whisper so faint, it almost seemed like a trick of the mind. The shadows in the room flickered, twisting in the dimming light. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the corners of the room, trying to see where it was coming from. But there was nothing. No one. I swallowed hard, trying to shake it off. It was just the house, just my imagination. Still, as I unpacked, the whispering didn't stop. It was always there, like someone was standing just outside the room, murmuring my name. Grace! I couldn't ignore it. I started walking around, checking every corner, opening closets, lifting rugs. But there was nothing, Nothing but shadows and silence when I dared to listen. My heart raced with every passing minute, each creak of the floorboards, each whisper in the air. It wasn't right, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I was determined to settle in, to make this place mine. I wouldn't let my imagination get the better of me. I moved into the kitchen, trying to distract myself, opening a can of soup, just something simple for dinner. That's when it happened again. I was standing at the stove, stirring the soup, when I heard it. A soft shuffle, like something dragging across the floor behind me. My blood ran cold, and I turned around, expecting to see something, someone. But there was nothing. The air in the room had grown colder too, an unnatural chill that sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I stayed frozen, staring into the darkening room. The shadows that had once seemed so innocent, so welcoming, were now growing longer, stretching across the floor, as though they were reaching for me. Grace. This time, the whisper wasn't just in the air. It was in my ears, right behind me, as though someone was breathing down my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just the room, empty except for me. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. I don't know why I didn't leave. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to stay, that somehow, something was waiting for me here. As I turned to head toward the bedroom, the door to the hallway creaked open on its own, just slightly, as if something unseen was beckoning me into the dark. I stepped forward, eyes wide with panic. That was when I heard it again, the whisper. Clearer now, louder. Grace. My name was a command now, sharp, insistent. And then, as if the walls themselves were alive, the temperature dropped. I could feel it, creeping in from the corners of the room, as the shadows thickened, pulling in like a blanket, suffocating the space. The air was thick, as though I was drowning in it. I backed away from the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. My feet stumbled over each other, my legs heavy with dread. I had to get out, I had to leave. But the shadows were waiting for me, filling the hall, blocking my escape. The room was darker now, the shadows seeming to stretch and breathe. They were moving. I ran, but the door wouldn't open, the lock wouldn't budge. The whispers, they kept coming, and I could feel them closing in around me, reaching out for me with cold, invisible fingers. I was trapped, and the apartment, with all its promises, with all its quiet charm, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison, and I had just walked right into its grasp. I should have known something was wrong the moment the sun set. It wasn't just the fading light, it was the air itself, thickening, suffocating the room. The apartment, which had seemed so inviting earlier, now felt like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind outside, made the silence inside that much more suffocating. I lay in bed, trying to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. But the room, this room, felt too still, too heavy. The shadows seemed to stretch in ways they shouldn't have. They weren't like normal shadows. These twisted and writhed, bending at unnatural angles. They crawled, slinking along the walls, moving with purpose. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from every corner of the room, waiting for me to let my guard down. The room felt colder now. I reached for the blanket and pulled it tighter around my shoulders, trying to ignore the coldness creeping beneath my skin. But the more I tried to shake it off, the more the feeling gnawed at me. I closed my eyes, hoping to sleep it off, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me like fingers reaching from the darkness. And then I heard it. A whisper, so soft it could have been a trick of the wind. But no, it was too deliberate, too familiar. It was a voice, or something that sounded like a voice, beckoning to me from the darkness. "Grace!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The name, my name, echoed in the stillness, so clear, so real. But when I turned my head to see who had spoken, the room was empty. Nothing but shadows and silence. But the whisper didn't stop. "Grace." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was closer now, as if it was right beside me, in my ear. But when I turned, nothing. The shadows shifted in the corners of my room, stretching out longer than they should have, twisting like they were alive. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just the house settling, the wind, or my imagination. But I couldn't. There was something wrong, something I couldn't explain. The air felt too cold now, too thick, and then I saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, a dark shape moved. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a flicker. But then it stretched, elongated, like a shadow trying to escape from its corner. It moved slowly, deliberately, creeping along the wall like a thing that had no business being there. I blinked, trying to focus, but when I looked again, the shadow was bigger, closer. I couldn't breathe. The whisper returned, louder now, sharper, as though it had teeth. "Grace, come closer." I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen, my mind screaming at me to get up, to run, to leave, but I couldn't move. The room was closing in on me. The shadows, no. The thing in the corner was no longer just a shadow. It was a presence, growing and shifting, like it had weight, like it had substance. I could feel it, pressing against me, pulling at my mind. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The shadows were everywhere now, slithering along the walls, creeping over the floor, reaching for me. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my skin, gnawing at my bones. I looked around the room, but it was darker now, too dark, and I couldn't see clearly. I could hear the whisper clearer than ever, but it wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a command. "Come closer." I could feel the darkness, feel it curling around me like a snake, tightening its grip. My eyes locked on the corner where the shape had started, and now I saw it more clearly. The shadow was no longer a shadow. It was a thing, a creature, something that shouldn't exist in the world of light. It had a face, or at least what I thought might be a face if it could be called that. It was twisted, hollow, with empty eyes and a mouth that was nothing more than a jagged black hole. It moved again, slithering across the floor toward me with a speed that made my stomach drop. It didn't walk, it crawled, like it was dragging itself toward me, its form stretching out impossibly long, like it could reach me no matter where I went. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I reached for the light beside my bed, my fingers trembling, but the switch wouldn't work. My entire body felt like it was frozen in place, trapped by the darkness. The thing, the shadow, was getting closer, closer, and I couldn't stop it. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, filling the room. Its coldness seeped into me, into the very air I was breathing. "Grace!" It whispered my name again. But it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command, a pull. I felt the shadows pulling at me, dragging me in. I could feel them, curling around my limbs, gripping me, pulling me toward the corner of the room, toward the thing that waited there. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could hear was my name, echoing, bouncing off the walls like 1,000 voices. The shadows reached for me, and I was too weak to resist. I felt them close in around me, wrapping themselves around my body, around my mind, swallowing everything whole. The last thing I saw was the empty face, that hole of blackness where eyes should have been, the last breath of air before the darkness took me completely. Then, there was nothing. The next morning felt like I had woken up in a dream, but not the comforting kind. No, this was the kind of dream where you realize halfway through that something's terribly wrong, but by then, it's too late to wake up. The shadows from last night still clung to my mind, lurking at the edges of my thoughts. I could feel them as soon as I opened my eyes. Cold, oppressive, like a weight on my chest. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, wouldn't leave. The air was thicker today, colder. Every corner of the apartment felt darker, even with the daylight creeping through the curtains. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow, as if I was still trapped in that nightmare. The whispers from last night echoed in my ears, the soft, insistent call of my name. Grace. I shook my head, trying to clear it, to ignore the irrational fear crawling under my skin, but it was impossible to forget. The shadows had been so close, so real, and I knew, deep down, that something in that apartment had changed me, had marked me. I needed answers. I needed someone who understood. That's when I noticed her, the woman next door. Martha. She had been watching me from her doorway earlier that morning, her gaze sharp, as though she knew exactly what I had experienced, as though she was waiting for me to come to her. I stood there for a moment frozen. The unease that had plagued me all morning flared up again, a sharp, cold wave of dread. But I couldn't keep running from it. I had to know what was happening. I walked toward her door, hesitant, each step heavier than the last. When I knocked, it wasn't so much a sound as it was a jolt of recognition, like something deep within the building responded to the sound, drawing me in. Martha opened the door almost immediately. There was no greeting, no smile, just a knowing, calculating look in her eyes. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting me in. Her apartment was dim, filled with shadows, the curtains drawn tight. It felt cold, oppressive, just like mine. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, I felt the weight of the building pressing in again. Heavier this time. The air was thick, charged with something I couldn't understand. She didn't waste any time. She turned to me, her eyes piercing, and spoke in a voice so quiet it was as if she had been expecting me all along. "You felt it, didn't you?" Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. There was no question in her tone, no doubt. She knew exactly what I had felt. The shadows, the whispers, the cold. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt tight, like the air had thickened just by entering her space. She didn't wait for me to ask. Instead, she motioned for me to sit, and I did, feeling a strange sense of urgency in her every movement. "The building," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's not what it seems. It never is it? It looks like any other old apartment building, but it's not. It's alive, Grace. Alive in a way you can't possibly imagine." I stared at her, my heart racing. Alive? What was she talking about? Martha's eyes flickered briefly to the window, as though searching for something outside, something beyond my reach. When she turned back to me, her expression had changed. She looked haunted. There was a family here years ago, a man, a father, who lost his mind. He killed his wife, his children, and then he took his own life. But it wasn't just a murder, she continued, her voice tightening. It was a sacrifice, the kind that ties your soul to this place, forever. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The room had grown colder, the silence hanging between us like a death sentence. "The spirits," she went on, her voice dropping lower. "They're not at rest. They can't be. They're trapped here, twisted by the violence that took their lives. And now they haunt this building. The shadows you see, they aren't just shadows. They're the remnants of their pain, their rage. They've been feeding on the fear of anyone who comes here. The longer you stay, the stronger they get. I couldn't breathe. The thought of the spirits, the shadows, feeding on fear, made my skin crawl, my blood run cold. It all made sense now, in the worst way. I wasn't imagining things. Martha leaned forward, her eyes fixed on me. The longer you resist them, the more powerful they become. They'll drag you in, Grace, and you'll never leave. The weight of her words settled in my chest like lead. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my heart pounding in my ears. "You can't stay here," Martha continued, her voice breaking. "I've seen it happen before. People think they can ignore it, outlast it, but the building won't let go. It will pull you in until there's nothing left of you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to tear myself from this place and never look back. But the thought of leaving, it felt impossible now. The apartment had become part of me, in a way I couldn't explain. "I can't leave," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. I don't know how." Martha's face softened, and for a moment I saw something like pity in her eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the hard, resigned look of someone who had already faced the worst. "You don't have a choice, Grace," she said softly. "You have to go. Now, before it's too late." But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something was pulling me back to that apartment. Something deeper than fear. It was like the building had already claimed me. Martha stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Please, I'm telling you this for your own good. If you stay, you won't make it out." I looked at her, at the desperation in her eyes. She was begging me now, in a way I hadn't expected. But the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal. I couldn't, not yet. There was too much unfinished business. And so, with a heavy heart, I stood up, my legs unsteady, my head spinning. As I turned toward the door, I heard Martha's voice, faint but insistent, echoing in my mind. "Don't say I didn't warn you. I know what you're thinking. I should have left. I should have listened to Martha. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about the apartment, something about the strange pull it had on me that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the comfort of having a place all to myself after so long. Or maybe it was just the fear of the unknown that kept me there. Either way, I stayed. And that was my mistake. The days passed, and I tried to ignore the lingering sense of dread that crept in every time the sun set. During the day, the apartment seemed fine, even cozy. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the chaos of the world. But as soon as night fell, the atmosphere would change. The air would grow heavier, thicker, like something was pressing down on me. The whispers would start, soft, like distant voices floating through the walls, just out of reach, but always there. They were barely audible at first, so faint I could have convinced myself they were just in my head. But as the days went on, they grew louder, more insistent. Grace. I could feel it then. Something was watching me. It wasn't just the whispers. It was the shadows, too. They weren't like normal shadows. They moved. They stretched. They slithered across the walls when I wasn't looking. Always just on the edge of my vision. Always there, just out of sight. I told myself it was the house settling, or the wind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. One night, after unpacking my last box, I decided to go to bed early, thinking the sooner I slept, the sooner it would all feel normal again. But as soon as the lights went out, the room felt different. Darker, colder, like the shadows were alive, crawling around me, waiting. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore the creeping panic, trying to tell myself that everything was fine. But then I heard it. The whispering. At first, it was so soft. I thought it was just the wind outside, rustling the leaves. But no, it was too deliberate, too close. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, as the voices grew louder, more distinct. Grace. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, lengthening, stretching toward me like fingers reaching out of the dark. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The whispers called to me, beckoning me closer, drawing me into the darkness. But I couldn't move. I couldn't break free from the grip of fear that held me there. And then I saw it. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure, tall, thin, and dark, standing in the corner of the room. Its shape was twisted, wrong. It had no face, just a blank, empty void where eyes should have been. It didn't move like a person. It slithered, its form twisting unnaturally, like it was made of smoke, like it wasn't even supposed to be real. But there it was, towering over me, its presence suffocating the air. I gasped, my lungs burning as I tried to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The shadows around it thickened, like they were alive, feeding off the fear that clung to me, growing stronger with every breath I took. Grace. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I could feel it in my mind, crawling through my thoughts like 1,000 fingers scratching at the inside of my skull. It wanted something from me. I could feel it. I didn't know what, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Not with that thing in the room. I stumbled out of bed, my body shaking violently as I ran toward the door, my feet barely touching the floor as I made my way to the hallway. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. I pulled on it, panic rising in my chest as I realized I was trapped. I couldn't get out. The shadows were closing in around me, and then, in the darkness, I heard something else. The sound of soft, shuffling footsteps. Closer now. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows, twisting and creeping across the walls, inching toward me like they were alive, like they were hungry. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, unable to escape, until the sound of the whispering stopped. And in the silence that followed, I realized it wasn't just in my mind anymore. The room was filled with them. They were everywhere. The shadows, the figures, the faces in the darkness, all moving, shifting, closing in around me. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder now, as if they were coming from all directions at once, surrounding me, pulling me under. The words were clearer now, clearer than ever, and they made my blood run cold. Come closer, Grace. It was no longer a request. It was an order, a demand. I tried to fight it. I tried to tear myself away, but the shadows were too strong. I could feel them pulling me, inch by inch, toward the dark corner of the room where the figure still waited, its empty eyes locked on me. And just before I felt myself falling into the darkness, I screamed. But no one heard me. I had to face it. There was no running anymore. I had tried to ignore it. The whispers, the shadows, the way the air in the apartment seemed to grow heavier and colder with each passing night. But tonight, I couldn't deny it. The whispers were louder, clearer, more insistent. The shadows were no longer just in the corners, creeping in my peripheral vision. They were alive, swirling around me, pressing in from all sides. I had to know what was happening. I had to confront whatever was haunting me before it consumed me completely. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped out into the hallway. The apartment felt different now. The walls seemed to close in, the air suffocating, heavy with a presence I couldn't shake. I wanted to turn back, to lock myself away, but I couldn't. Something in me, something darker than fear, compelled me to move forward. The living room was the worst. It had always felt strange, but tonight it felt like a void. Like it was pulling everything into it, devouring all the light, all the warmth. The shadows in the far corner of the room were thicker now, like they were waiting for me, anticipating my arrival. I could feel them before I even entered the room, their coldness, their hunger. It was like the very space around me had turned into a trap, and I had walked right into it. I stepped forward cautiously, each footfall too loud in the suffocating silence. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the center of the room. The shadows had gathered there, coalescing into something I could only describe as a presence, something alive. They were no longer just darkness. They had form, they had weight. I could feel them pressing against me, suffocating me with their cold. And then, in the midst of it, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shape in the shadows, barely discernible. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was tall, thin, and featureless. Its face was just a blank void, an empty hole where eyes should have been. The air around it seemed to ripple, bending, warping, like the shadows were alive, breathing. Grace. The voice echoed through the room, though the figure's mouth didn't move. The sound was coming from everywhere at once, from inside my head, from the walls, from the very air. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a command, a pull. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest, it drowned out everything else. But even with my fear crushing me, I couldn't look away. I was drawn to it, to that empty face, to those hollow eyes that seemed to reach through me, past me into the very core of my being. Grace, it said again. But this time, the voice was deeper, more guttural, like it was made of darkness itself. You've come. Finally. The air grew colder, like the temperature in the room had dropped 50 degrees in an instant. My breath came in shallow gasps, the frost forming on the edges of my vision. It was real. The thing, the shadow, it wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was here, and it wanted something from me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to listen. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my legs shaking beneath me, my hands trembling. The figure stepped forward, its movement smooth, unnatural, like it was sliding through the shadows rather than walking. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and distort, twisting, reaching out toward me like hands. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. What do you want from me? The figure tilted its head as if considering my question. Then it spoke again, its voice a hiss, a breath in the darkness. We want what was taken from us, it said, its voice low, like the rustle of dry leaves. We were sacrificed, and now you will pay. I couldn't understand. Sacrificed? Who? Why? I wanted to ask, but the words stuck in my throat, too thick with fear to come out. The shadows grew denser, pressing in closer, like the figure was feeding off my terror, growing stronger with every passing second. They took everything from us, it continued, the tone growing colder, more venomous, and now we will take you. I tried to take a step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadows reached for me, cold tendrils curling around my ankles, my legs, pulling me into the darkness. I could feel their icy grip, dragging me toward the center of the room, toward the thing that was waiting for me. No, I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The shadows were suffocating me, their coldness seeping into my skin, into my soul. The figure, if it could even be called that, loomed closer, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I could feel its presence, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice. The shadows closed in, filling every inch of the room, until there was nothing left but the darkness and that terrible, consuming voice. "We were trapped here," it hissed, "and now you are ours, forever." The room spun, the shadows swirling around me like a whirlwind. I couldn't see anymore, couldn't think. I could only feel the coldness, the hunger, the emptiness. The whispers came faster now, louder, a chorus of voices all calling my name, all demanding something from me. And then, everything went black. I couldn't breathe. The darkness had swallowed me whole, and the air felt thicker with each passing second. It pressed in on me, suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers were deafening now. Every inch of me was filled with them. "Grace." The voices hissed, scraped, whispered my name in 1,000 different ways, 1,000 different tones, but they all carried the same message. I was theirs. The figure, that thing made of shadow, had pulled me in. I had thought I was stronger than it, that I could fight it. I was wrong. It was everywhere now, filling every inch of the apartment with its presence. Its hollow eyes stared at me from every corner, from every shadow. I couldn't escape. The coldness, the darkness, the hunger, it was all consuming. I was being pulled into it, piece by piece, and I couldn't stop it. I wanted to scream, but the air in my lungs wouldn't move. The shadows reached for me, wrapping themselves around my limbs, tightening like chains. The more I struggled, the tighter they pulled, and soon I felt like I couldn't move at all. The cold seeped into my bones, into my very soul. I was losing myself, slipping into the dark, and there was nothing left to hold on to. But then, I remembered something. A tiny flicker of light, a small stubborn spark deep inside me. I wasn't just going to let it take me. I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, more urgent. "Grace," they called. "Come to us, come closer." They clawed at my mind, digging in, wrapping themselves around my thoughts. But somewhere, deep inside, I found the strength to fight back. I pushed. I focused all of my energy on that flicker of light, that small, burning part of me that refused to be consumed. I reached into the darkness, into the cold, and I yanked at the thread of light that still remained. The shadows recoiled, pulling back, as if the light itself was a weapon they couldn't touch. But they didn't stop. No, the more I fought, the stronger they became. The room twisted, the walls seemed to stretch and bend like they were made of living things, warping, breathing. The apartment was no longer just a building, it was alive. The shadows, the spirits, they were feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every ounce of panic I let slip through my clenched fists. "Grace." The voice was inside me now, in my head, crawling into my thoughts, like it had been there all along, waiting for me to break. The figure was closer now, impossibly close, its hollow eyes boring into me, its mouth stretching wide in a grotesque grin, though it had no face. I was trapped. And then, for a fleeting moment, I felt it. The thing I had been denying. It wasn't just the apartment or the shadows or the spirits that had trapped me here, it was me. I had let them in. I had ignored the warnings. I had denied the truth, thinking I could push it away. But now I saw it clearly. There was no escape. There was no running. I had become part of this place. Part of them. The shadows surged forward, and I felt them wrap around my chest, my neck. I gasped, my heart racing, my body trembling, but I couldn't break free. They were everywhere now. I was inside the darkness. I had always been. It was here, in me. The thing that had been waiting. But as they closed in, As the blackness swallowed everything, there was one final moment. A single, fleeting thought that fought through the terror. I will never let them win. But in that moment, as the shadows consumed me whole, I realized it was already too late. They had won. I had given myself to them, and then there was only darkness. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.